This is SSN.
Story Studio Network.
I'm Tom Hoppe, and I'm your host of the Most Painful Podcast. Before I start the show today, I just want to say thank you to our listening audience. Our show has grown. We're being heard both in Canada, the US, Europe, and other places in the world. And that's all due to your feedback to help us make this show better. And also coming up, we're launching the French version of the Most Painful Podcast. And to finish off season 2, I'm going to have the host of the French version of the Most Painful Podcast, Luc Hibert, on the show to talk about the show itself and when it's going to start. Once again, I'd like to thank everybody for making this show possible and listening to the show and providing your feedback. We're going to have season 3 starting in the fall of 2023. So please send us your suggested topics because we want to provide evidence-based information to help you, veterans, clinicians, researchers, anybody struggling with pain. So send your suggestions in. You can contact us on Facebook and Twitter at Chronic Pain, COE, and on Instagram at chronicpain_COE. Thanks for your support, and now we'll carry on with the show. When someone is suffering from chronic pain, movement has been proven to be helpful in conditioning, recovery, and overall improvement in health. But what are safe movements, and how does one do them safely when they are suffering from chronic pain? How do we make veterans aware they must change how they approach physical training that may be completely different from the movements they have learned in service? To talk to me today about this, I'm joined by Dr. Lindsay Rite, the Director of Allied Health at CHANGEPain Clinic in Vancouver. Lindsay, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Tom. My pleasure to be here.
Maybe just to start us off today, you could talk to us about what is chronic pain and how it can impact movement.
Chronic pain is generally considered any pain or suffering that lasts greater than 3 months. At that point, it's generally believed that any tissue injury or damage should be healed and recovered at that point. And so the ongoing signaling that continues to occur in chronic pain really speaks to the very real changes that are happening at the brain and spinal cord level. And how this affects our interaction with movement is a bit nuanced. So I'm happy to give you an example about that.
Sure, yeah, why don't you? So our audience knows the difference there.
How we learn that pain and movement is coupled is through our lived experience. So perhaps in our early days, we would do certain activities and we would learn that pain, discomfort generally starts to signal to us when we have reached our tissue maximum. So for example, on the West Coast here, we like to hike up mountains. And so perhaps I'm headed up a mountain and they're fairly tall and steep here. So at some point I might start to experience some discomfort in my legs. Maybe my calves are cramping. My body starts feeling fairly fatigued. And so I learn and I know that I'm getting pretty close to what my tissues and my body can perform and what it can do. And then basically at that point, you then decide. You can either decide to push a little bit and then maybe take the next few days off and recover. And in that way, you would, if you kept repeating that, you would get fitter and stronger. But you also could choose at that moment to push right through and go right to the top of the mountain and push as hard and as fast as you possibly can. And in that process, you might possibly get some tissue injury or damage. But nonetheless, the important point is that at that point in our life, we learn that tissue discomfort, we believe it's linked with tissue maximum. That is a learned belief, and in most circumstances is true, but it's actually not 100% accurate, all right? Pain is not a signal of tissue maximum, but instead pain is a signal of threat. So there's a nuance there. And unfortunately, what happens in chronic pain is our threat detector becomes quite sensitized. And this speaks to the changes that are happening in multiple systems in our body. But this detection system is overly sensitive, not only to our body signals, but also into our environment. And the other thing that happens in chronic pain that's important is there is a decoupling of that discomfort signal with our tissue capacity. So in chronic pain, we can no longer trust that the signals our bodies are sending us are correlated with our tissue maximum. And relearning what is safe in our body requires us to go back into our body, find safety there, and then slowly recondition ourselves, first to desensitize that threat detector, and then next move towards meaningful goals that help us physically recondition and get us back to the functional goals that we'd like to do. That may include climbing a mountain.
So what I understand you're saying is, anybody who's doing high activity is going to have some muscle soreness, is going to have some, weakness because they're tired. But what chronic pain is doing is that signal is coming on a lot earlier or is consistently there, and it prevents us from moving because it hurts too much. Is that kind of, I guess, a layman's term of it?
Yes, exactly. So in chronic pain, our threat detectors are very sensitized, and that again speaks to the real changes that are happening at the brain and body level. And so that now becomes very difficult to determine what is safe exercise in our body. And so the process of reestablishing safe function and safe movement and boundaries around that is a process that has to be reestablished in the face of chronic pain. And our learnings outside of chronic pain kind of mislead us in direction that's no longer serving us.
How are we misled in that? Can you give an example?
Yeah. Most individuals, when we try to determine how to do exercise, if we're doing this independently on our own, we tend to do one of three strategies. The first strategy a lot of people tend to do would be they go kind of no pain, no gain. So we push ourselves through all of our thresholds and kind of rush to that top of the mountain and go as hard as we possibly can. That would be one strategy. And I think that is pretty consistent with the military mindset of kind of pushing through as hard as possible. Civilians don't tend to do that strategy as much. What they tend to do is eventually learn this kind of bust and boom strategy where they overdo and underdo. So they're overdoing activity in their daily life because they're motivated or maybe they're having a good day with their pain, and so they do too much. And then unfortunately for several days or maybe even weeks after that, they kind of crash and burn, and this can take them some time to recover. And I'd say the third strategy that most people would recruit is at some point, usually after doing the bust and booming for a very long time, they tend to then be very avoidant and fearful of almost all activities. And so they kind of stop doing most things. And so this is really, we kind of recruit one of three strategies to determine what activities we should and shouldn't do in our life. And again, it's based on past experiences, culture, training. And so again, the military is likely quite different than civilians, but there are individual differences between people as well.
Yeah, I mean, the mission first, self last, and push through at all costs does come at a price. And pacing is not in the vocabulary, as we know. I always joke and say, the first time someone told me pacing, I thought they were going to run beside me. So I didn't realize it was to slow down. If you have chronic pain and you're not doing movement, that also is not, my understanding, is not good as well, right? So does it create this vicious cycle of it hurts too much, I'm not going to get up and do anything, but yet we need to move? And if that's the case, how do we get someone engaged to get them moving? And I guess I have two parts to this question. First part is movement's obviously important, and why is it? So I would ask you that question. And the second one is, how do you get people engaged who are in that vicious cycle of it hurts and I don't want to do anything, but I know it's important for me to do something? So two parts to that question.
Yes, and they both are closely linked, and it really goes back to kind of that previous comment of that's a learned experience. We learn in chronic pain, because our threat detectors are more sensitive, that when we do certain things, sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. And so it's very frustrating and confusing that when I try to do something, even if I really want to do that thing or that activity, sometimes I really pay for it and suffer for it. So it's not usually a lack of motivation or a lack of desire to do that. It's not a laziness. It's really a learned response that movement can be dangerous and it can set me back and it can have very detrimental effects. And so the way out of that is actually learning how to do safe movement. So I could maybe speak to some protocols on how we would work someone through that.
Yeah, I think that would be helpful for people to understand.
So the first steps is about understanding pain. right? And again, when we think that pain is so closely coupled with our tissue capacity, that is confusing. So it is important to firstly understand that that is no longer coupled in chronic pain. So pain is not a reliable source of how much your tissues can or cannot do. All right. And so there are various resources online. I know the CPCOE has various resources where we can start to learn about what's called pain neuroscience and understand what's happening in our body so that we have a different narrative, a different story about what that pain means. And so in doing that, that can be a first step so that we don't try and keep going back to those old habits of, no pain, no gain, or busting and booming. So that's really step number one. And then the second step, once people have kind of understood a new narrative around pain, is then finding ways to decrease the threat in our daily life. And so most of us really live in a very high sympathetic state. So our fight and flight system is constantly on alert. We're always checking our environment, whether it's our work environments, our home. There seems to be a lot of stimulus that might overwhelm our system. Again, for those in chronic pain, their detection system is very alert. So again, busy environments, sounds, a lot of people, a lot of action happening around us can be very triggering. And I'm sure you can speak to that, particularly for veterans. And so the next step would really be about finding ways to calm our nervous system, to bring in more relaxation, more parasympathetic, to balance out the amount of sympathetic stimulus we've either had in the past or that we constantly have now.
And so when you're doing that, you're calming the system. What does that help the person do when it comes to safe movement?
When the system's calmer, we have more capacity to do more things. When we're constantly kind of being pushed to our limits, there's not a lot of space to do rehabilitation or recovery. And so we need to create space first. And so for a lot of people, when they start doing safe movement, they're perhaps recommended yoga therapy or breath work or pool therapy. And a lot of this actually has to do with that parasympathetic state, is trying to calm the system, but also perhaps gently introduce some movement without overwhelming the system.
So when you talk parasympathetic, can you maybe just Cole's notes on what that means so people kind of understand the difference between the two and how, obviously what I'm hearing from you is knowledge is important to help someone move because they understand their own pain. So can you maybe explain that just quickly, what it means?
Sure. We have our autonomic nervous system. There are two sides to it. There is a side that is called the sympathetic, and the other side is called a parasympathetic. And it generally can be simplified into our sympathetic is our fight or flight, and then our parasympathetic is kind of that rest and digest. And so our nervous system will pendulate from one side to the other based on our environment. And so again, in military environment, I would assume there's a lot of exposure to the more sympathetic side where you're constantly bombarded with potential or realized threats. And so you have to be constantly on alert. You have to be in a position where you can either fight or flight, which would be kind of move away. The parasympathetic system would be, when you don't feel under threat and you're very relaxed, your body can kind of digest and not worry about other stimulus, and instead perhaps you can go more into your body. But if you are in a threatened state, being relaxed is actually quite dangerous because you can't mobilize yourself quickly to protect yourself or others around you.
And so when we look at chronic pain, what I understand you're saying is if this is heightened, if we're in this fight or flight all the time, which, of course, releases cortisol and does other thing in the body, so it heightens the sensitivity of the body. So my injury may have been healed, but now that area is a lot more sensitive. So I guess I'm triggered sooner to the signs of pain, which may not be pain, but it's just the sensitivity of my system because it's at a heightened state. Is that what I'm understanding?
The sympathetic may or may not be related to pain signals directly, but being in a more pro-sympathetic state does increase our sensitivity. And so that makes it really difficult to help someone move towards getting stronger and fitter because the whole system is more responsive. So, the goal at this point, again, in an exercise program would be, let's decrease the threats that we're perceiving around us, and let's then create some space in that regard to start moving towards some new functional goal. And in our world, in my world, it's mostly about achieving something kind of more in a physical nature. So we would want to help someone move towards a meaningful goal, which may look like getting back to hiking. It may look like getting back to activities with their family, going for a bike ride with their children. Maybe it's a work-related task, or being able to do stuff in the garage again, woodwork, or other just meaningful activity. But to get there, you have to have perhaps more physical conditioning than you currently do.
So it's not about when we hear movement, hitting the gym and pumping iron or going for a run. It's about, what I hear you saying, is calming the nervous system down first, and then slowly progressing to whatever the person wants to do. If they want to play golf or run again, or whatever they're able to do, that's what I'm hearing you say.
Yeah, exactly. So a bit of education, calm the nervous system, set a meaningful goal that is relevant to that individual. And then, yes, we do very slow and evidence-based progressions to help someone do one step at a time to get there. And so that's actually fairly consistent between all chronic pain patients. But there are individual differences to meet people's personality and background. But then specifically for veterans, I think there are a couple of nuances to each of those steps as well that should be considered given the kind of military mindset and identity and culture.
Yeah, so and we've talked about that in other shows too, where you can do all the medical side, and the what you do is allied health, which is all the physio, the chiro, probably missing a few things in there. Meditation, nutrition, I believe that's all under your umbrella. It's a combination of all those things, but then dealing with the purpose, dealing with mindset change and culture change. But I think we see that non-military veterans too, right? If someone's had a serious car crash and now they can't do what they've done before, is try to redevelop that purpose. And, just as we're finishing off here, because you've touched on something, when we're talking about purpose and pain, is that also a barrier to someone maybe not having the motivation or the willingness, maybe not using correct terms, to move, to start doing exercise, to start doing safe movement? Could that also be a barrier?
I can't say I can think of any individual that has not had a desire to move more and to get more functional. It is the barriers that we have to overcome. And so, yes, veterans, civilians, they all have their own unique barriers. I find when you're talking about the mission, I think for the military individuals I've worked with, and veterans specifically, they have a hard time in setting meaningful goals for themselves, because sometimes they are trying to put their family first, or whatever they identify as their current team and mission, that comes first, not themselves. And so when we ask them, no, you need to pace, you need to do less, we're going to do this one step at a time, but perhaps their family member asks them, can you clean out the garage? And so they don't want to say no, and so they go and overdo that, and that causes this kind of crash and burn effect. And so it's not a lack of desire of wanting to do it, it's about realizing some of the barriers that are getting in the way. And it may be around mindset of trying to serve everyone else without prioritizing self. That's one thing I often see too in the military, is that when we ask them to do an activity, for example, I can think of a veteran we had recently, we would run them through a 6-minute walk test. It's a simple 6-minute walk test. The goal typically is to see how far someone can walk in that 6 minutes. And so civilians, you can tell them, let's go on this treadmill, please comfortably walk, and we'll just measure your heart rate and your distance after that. Whereas a certain mindset, if it's more based on outcome, if they see the goal is, again, it's like that top of the mountain. If the goal is to create as much distance as possible in those 6 minutes, they will just push and push. So they're not regulating themselves based on their pain, whereas others may kind of stop sooner because of that pain signaling. So again, realizing the individual in front of you, their barrier to doing movement safely might again be part of that training, that culture where I'm just going to push as hard as I can so that I get the outcome. The process doesn't matter. whereas really we need them to bring them back down to a state where they can be in their body, a bit more parasympathetic, and then create that awareness where we can again better couple tissue tolerance and discomfort and body signaling so that we can trust in our bodies again and slowly step forward towards our meaningful goals. But why we can't do that speaks to what's happening in our bodies due to chronic pain. And the barriers, though, are quite personalized and can be based on our lived experiences and our environments as well.
So to just wrap it up, what I'm hearing you say is knowledge is key.
Mm-hmm.
Understanding, learning about chronic pain, how it impacts our body, calming the nervous system, taking that out of this, and then starting our movement slowly guided by a team like yourself to get to a point where we want to go. Is there anything else you'd add to that to summarize our talk today?
No, I think that's great. And I think for those that don't quite have a team, of course, there's the resources on the CPCOE website there to connect with pain centers. But from a movement perspective, generally we can start with very safe practices, breath work. There are specific yoga studios with military training or pain training. Pool therapy is often recommended as well. That can all, if you have various environmental triggers, that can be difficult, but it's usually a pretty safe environment. So a team is helpful, but there are some gentle practices that can get you started in the right direction.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much for your time on the show today, Lindsay. We've heard some very good information that's going to, I'm sure, help a lot of people that are listening. So thanks for being on the show.
Wonderful. Thank you, Tom. Thanks for having me.
And for your audience, if you want to provide any feedback about the show or you want more information on chronic pain, you can visit our website at veteranschronicpain.ca or follow us on Facebook and Twitter, Chronic Pain COE, and on Instagram at chronicpain_COE. And there's lots of information on there, regardless if you're a veteran or non-veteran, if you're a researcher, clinician, lots of information on there that could be helpful in many different ways. So once again, thank you for listening, and please stay safe and keep the hope alive.
The Most Painful Podcast is produced for the Chronic Pain Center of Excellence by Story Studio Network and Eye Contact Productions.